Some of Dungeons & Dragons' most iconic monsters come from ancient myths, some from pulp novels, and some from cheap plastic toys. This is the real story behind the monsters you thought you knew, today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today I'm going to be talking about the origins of some of D&D's most iconic monsters in the game. Now, a lot of these you probably think you know, and you probably do. The ones that come from mythology, especially Greek mythology, I think people would know. But the origins of a lot of the other monsters are actually quite different, and they might surprise you. And I think as you go through the video, I can almost guarantee that some of these things will pop out to you as being things that you didn't know. Now, I did base this video on a few things, obviously my own research that I did. I have been looking into these things for a while because I'm someone who is curious about this kind of stuff. When I would see a monster, I wanted to know where it came from. So even going all the way back to when I first got, for me, the first monster book I ever got was this one, the Monster Manual 2 from 1983. I got that way before I got either the Fiend Folio or the Monster Manual. I had seen these, but I borrowed them from friends. We kind of had a deal that we would each buy a different book so that we could share. And my mom gave me the Monster Manual 3 because she knew that my friends had the other two books. So that's part of it. But in the course of doing that research, of course, I did come across some different blog posts and some different videos. And I know that you've probably seen videos like this or similar to this on YouTube, those little short, punchy, less than 10-minute videos that give you like the surprising thing that you didn't know about the monsters. And it's kind of very surface level, and that's fine. Those videos serve a purpose, and they're very attuned to the way YouTube wants you to consume media. But of course, this is my channel, and I don't really do things that way. So this isn't going to be a scratch the surface kind of thing. It's going to be some deep dives into the history and the origins of these different monsters, where they came from, who created them for Dungeons and Dragons, which books they first debuted in, all of that kind of stuff. Just the kind of deeper dives that you're used to here on the channel. Now, some of these we have talked about before, and a lot of them actually, interestingly, first debuted in issues of either the Strategic Review or in Dragon Magazine. And a lot of times in those, I will go into a little bit of the origins of those. So that's a playlist. I have a playlist called The History of Dragon Magazine. And I highly encourage you not to sleep on that playlist. I know the video titles and the thumbnails tend to not be as like punchy and in your face and make it look like it's a must watch, but you will not learn more about the history of the evolution of Dungeons and Dragons than watching those particular playlists. And I know that the people that typically watch this channel, you're not going to sleep on that because you aren't like influenced by the gimmicks, right? You want the information, you want the details. So definitely follow that playlist. I'm up through issue 18 now. Plus I've done all 7 issues of the Strategic Review, and there will be another one coming soon. I usually do about 2 issues per video on that. So keep on a lookout for that. Now, in the course of doing this, I did look at some other things. So one of my friends, I'm going to call him a friend. I haven't met him in person, but I have gamed with him actually online, which is not something I typically do. So I've only gamed D&D like online through Zoom, Discord, whatever, maybe like 2 or 3 times in my life. It's just not a thing that I do. I typically play with my friends here locally that I know. But I played with a group of folks that were brought together to play test a adventure written for Dragonlance, and it was actually for 5th edition, which was cool for me because I don't get a lot of chance to play 5th edition. I don't run 5th edition. I've only played it, like, I can count the number of times on one hand, including the couple of times that I played in this online game. But one of the people who played that runs a blog called Scroll for Initiative, and I met him actually on Twitter originally, and it seems like he's a really nice guy, and he did an interesting overview on he did it based on the 5th edition monster manual, but a lot of those monsters are going to translate over to the TSR era of Dungeons and Dragons. But he did a look at like basically just the origins, like, is this coming from mythology? And if it is it French? Is it Greek? Is it, Egyptian, like what have you? And so I found that really helpful. And I think if you want like a quick kind of overview of the influences of where these monsters come from. That's a great place to start. I'll put a link to it in the show notes below. And then also DM David did a blog post where he talked about a few different monsters. And DM David is a great blog to follow if you are interested in old school Dungeons and Dragons. Again, I'll put a link in the show notes below. And then lastly, I found a pretty fun thread on Reddit, which is not a place that I visit all the time, but this was from a user on Reddit called PhD Mented. And, he or I'm guessing it's a he, had listed some of the influences and the inspirations and the origins of some of the different monsters. There were a few mistakes, like in that particular one, consistently, he says that Eldritch Wizardry was written by Dave Arneson, which, it wasn't. It was written by Gygax and Brian Bloom. Dave Arneson was the author for Blackmore, and even with that, we know that a lot of that was also written by Steve Marsh and by Tim Kask, who was the editor. But in any case, it was a good place to start. And then I just took some of those and then, dug deeper to kind of figure this stuff out. Okay, so that's a kind of, where we're going to approach this. So what I'm going to do is kind of break this into buckets, essentially. So I'm going to have some major buckets here that are going to be, folklore and mythology is going to be one. I'm going to have one that's going to be like pulp fiction stories and the Appendix N. And if you don't know what the Appendix N is, basically that is a list of inspirational sources, mostly fictional sources, that Gary Gygax lists in the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And so a lot of the monsters are inspired by those stories because those were the stories that inspired Gary Gygax, being one of the co-creators of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. So that'll be one of the areas. Then I'm going to have sort of like what I call a pop culture section. So this is going to be things like movies or comic books and toys, like a toy line, or line's probably not the right word, but a selection of toys that influenced the creation of a lot of Dungeons and Dragons monsters. And then I'm going to have, I guess, the last couple of buckets. I'm going to have one that's monsters that were just kind of created like from scratch for Dungeons and Dragons specifically. Now, a lot of these are going to overlap in some cases, and we'll talk about that. And then the last one's going to be ones that we just don't know. Now, obviously, I can't go over every single monster. I did try to focus on ones from original Dungeons and Dragons or the Monster Manual, but I am going to be talking about quite a few from the Fiend Folio and the Monster Manual too as well. And I'm kind of just trying to pick, some of them are iconic monsters and others are just ones that I thought that the origins were really interesting and maybe would surprise you. Okay. But again, because I can't cover all of them, definitely let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear, like, if these were surprising to you. Maybe you already knew them. Maybe you didn't know all of them or some of them. Maybe you disagree with some of them. That's fine too. Just be respectful and cool and tell me why. And then let me know if there's monsters that you were interested in that I didn't cover. And it's possible that I might do a follow-up on this in the future. If I get enough interest in that. Okay. So you can leave all of that in the comments below. And the other thing I would encourage you to do is that if this kind of deep dive history of this Dungeons and Dragons and the monsters and just the game in general is of interest to you, please take a few seconds to like the video, double check that you're subscribed to the channel, and make sure that you've adjusted the settings on the bell icon so that YouTube will notify you when I upload a new video. And that's one's very important, because if you subscribe but don't adjust the bell icon, YouTube's not necessarily going to let you know that I've uploaded a new video. I do usually upload on Tuesday mornings at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And if I'm not going to, I will put a community post there. But the best way to know is just hit the bell icon, and then you'll automatically get it into your feed. All right. So what I want to start out with is, again, talking about some of the different origins of these monsters and covering a few things just to kind of like set the table, so to speak, before we get into the actual origins. So obviously there's going to be real world origins for some of these, and I'm not going to go over those types of monsters. So stuff like dinosaurs, animals, that kind of stuff, I think you can figure that out. But there's some that are interesting that are related, and I'm not going to go over those either. An example of that would be something like the Axebeak. So the Axebeak here from the Monster Manual, this is the original Monster Manual from 1977. And that is most likely based on an extinct bird from the Cenozoic era called, I'm going to do my best to pronounce this, the Forest Racidae, something like that, PH for us. So those kinds of things I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on. Now, a lot of monsters, of course, are going to come into D&D from two of its main predecessor games. So that would be Blackmoor and Chainmail. Okay, so this is, again, if you've watched the channel before, this is the first fantasy campaign by Dave Arneson explaining his Blackmoor campaign. Now, while this is not published until 1977, it's basically his notes that he wrote, the majority of which in this book actually predate the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, there's also some research that's been done that would indicate that quite a few bits of information in Blackmoor also predate Chainmail. And I think most people kind of get that. You know, it's difficult because in the 70s, Gary Gygax made a lot of claims that basically Dave Arneson based Blackmoor on the fantasy supplement from Chainmail. And that was a gross overstatement. So, but it's kind of hard to know because these things aren't always documented. Like, we know Blackmoor predates Chainmail. It's hard to tell sometimes, a lot of times, how much stuff from the Blackmoor that we know now was predating Chainmail. We know it predated it in general, but like when you get down to specifics, and the monsters is what I'm talking about here, right? So, you know, there were a lot of giant monsters in Blackmoor. Obviously, Gertie the Dragon, a very famous Blackmoor character, and that I would assume predates Chainmail, fantasy Chainmail, because I think it was a popular monster or encounter. Maybe monster is not the right word, but character almost in the game, Gertie the Dragon. Okay, and this is a photo of that. This is this is the clay model, and I think it's the original one that Dave Arneson created. This was a photo taken by someone who attended Gary Con. I just found it online. I'll put a credit on here on the screen so you can see whose photo it is. But they attended Gary Con back in 2019, Gary Con 11, I believe it was. And so there's Gertie the Dragon. So we know that there's dragons, right, in Blackmoor. Well, there's a case to be made that there are certain monsters in Blackmoor that look like they probably predate Chainmail. And I read this whole very interesting thread on EN World. And the user, unfortunately, the name is Guest. So I don't know who it is. I mean, there's Guest and like a bunch of numbers. But this person posited a theory that if you look at the monsters that are listed in Chainmail, and then you look at the monsters that are listed in First Fantasy Campaign, and very specifically, if you look at the monsters that are listed in the Magic Swords section of Chainmail, the Magic Swords will tell you what type of monsters these swords are good against fighting, and that's the monster list that we're talking about here. And then you look at the monsters that come from Leonard Patt's Rules for Middle-earth game, right? Which now we know, we didn't know this originally. This is scholarship that's come out, I would say, within the past, less than 20 years. That Leonard Patt's Rules for Middle-earth directly influenced the creation of Chainmail. So then the kind of question becomes, well, had Dave Arneson seen the rules for Middle-earth by Leonard Patt as he was developing Blackmoor and before the publication of Chainmail? And these timelines are very, very quick. They're pretty tight. So the rules for Middle-earth were originally published, I believe, November of 1970. And Chainmail is going to be published officially in 1971. However, versions of it had gotten out before that. So it's kind of hard to say with some of these things, like who had seen what and when. So there's a lot of assumptions being made. But basically, the person who did this thing on EN World, this thread about the monsters from Blackmoor, noted that there's certain monsters listed in the Magic Swords section that don't necessarily cross over with Chainmail and look like maybe they predate Chainmail, and specifically some of the terms and the words that they use. And so the list is Balrog, Elemental, Ghoul, Giant, Goblin, Ogre, Werebear, Werewolf, Wraith. And then you have Ghost in the list here for the Magic Swords of Matrix, which is not in Chainmail. You also have Mortals, or Mortal, singular, not listed in Chainmail. And you have Pudding, not listed in Chainmail. So the Pudding one is interesting to me because I've seen that Gary Gygax created, like the black pudding. However, we see it listed in the sword matrix, magic swords and matrix section of First Fantasy campaign, and Dave Arneson specifically says that this is some of the earliest stuff for Blackmore. He says, prior to setting up Blackmore, I spent a considerable effort in setting up an entire family of magic swords. So he said prior to doing Blackmore, he did this. So again, it's kind of vague, but there would seem to be some evidence here or some suggestion that something like a pudding, and it's not black pudding, it's puddings, which could be the whole realm of puddings and jellies, right? So green slimes and all those types of things. A lot of those could be coming from Dave Arneson before the creation of chainmail, because those monsters aren't listed in chainmail. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff that I find fascinating. I love trying to figure this kind of stuff out and knowing who did what and when and who was influenced by what. So I think that's really interesting. Now, there's a whole other list here. There's anti-hero, dragon, ant, orc, troll, wizard. All of those are in the Magic Swords matrix here in First Fantasy campaign, which, again, that's sort of like early Blackmore or almost pre-Blackmore, it seems like. Those are also listed in Leonard Patt's rules for Middle Earth games. So it might be that some of those came into Blackmore and then they got lifted into chainmail. So the whole theory of this thread is that there's a lot of monsters in chainmail that actually came from Blackmore, not vice versa. I don't think we have definitive proof. I just think it's an interesting discussion. So that is the First Fantasy campaign. Now, there are a list of monsters here in chainmail, and these are all, of course, going to predate inclusion in Dungeons and Dragons in the fantasy section here. So let's see what we have. So you can see we have halflings and sprites, dwarves, gnomes, goblins, kobolds. Those are all coming from, folklore and mythology. Halflings, of course, very much inspired by Tolkien. Originally, that would have said hobbits until, the reprintings where they changed to hobbits to say halflings. Elves, fairies, and orcs. Again, all coming from folklore. However, the ones that are in here are very much modeled and patterned after the ones in Tolkien. Ogres and trolls, jinn, dragons, ifrit, elementals, treants, giants, and rocks. So jinn, of course, is Arabic, as are ifrit. And then dragons have a very wide variety of different cultural and mythological sources. Elementals, now treants those are ents from Tolkien. And then you have giants, which again have a lot of different mythological and folkloric inspirations. And we'll talk about that later on as we get into the core of the video. And then rocks, of course, that's coming from mythology and folklore as well. So then you have man-sized figures that include ghouls. So that's interesting. We're going to talk about ghouls later. Heroes, anti-heroes, superheroes of the Conan type, shape changers, wights, wizards, and wraiths. So race in here, they don't come from Tolkien, but the way that they're described in D&D, they're patterned on the ring race from Tolkien. And then wights also coming from folklore. So a lot of these are coming from folklore and mythology in chainmail. There's not necessarily things in here that are, aside from the way that they're described, based on the Tolkien model, they're not necessarily coming from fiction for the most part. They're coming from mythology and folklore. So that's kind of our list here in chainmail. Now, the other thing that we have that is a pretty big section are demons and devils, and I'm not going to include them in this video because it was just going to make it way too long, and I think that probably could be its own video talking about the different demons and devils in D&D and which ones were made up from whole cloth and which ones are based on things from folklore and mythology. So that will be a different video at some point in the future. Okay, so let's go over our first, bucket, which is going to be mythology and folklore. And again, I just cherry picked a few of these to kind of give you a sense of like how deep and rich the folklore traditions are in the game of Dungeons and Dragons. It goes beyond just like the standard, Greek and Norse stuff. It's very, very wide. And there's probably creatures in here that you didn't realize were actually based on Earth folklore. And I always say that, when I worked on my campaign world, I've been working on it since the mid 80s and I'm still working on it today. I've always very much been inspired by real world history and also real world folklore stories and mythology. Because I always think that those are such a rich mine of ideas, and people tend to overlook them and think that, it's better to create something from scratch. But I don't think you're ever going to find anything as creative and inspirational as something that actually happened in real world history, right? So that's just me. But let's look at a monster here just right out the gate, just to kind of show you. And this is kind of fun because my daughter just did a project kind of based on something very similar to this for her school. But this is the, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correct, but I've always said Almirage. But you see this here. This is in the Fiend Folio from 1981. Okay. And it describes it up here. On the next page, it says it generally roams pastures and woodlands, but is sometimes discovered in dungeons, lairs, usually a small cave just below ground. Resembles a large yellow hare with a long 1.5 to 2 foot black horn protruding forwards from the center of its forehead, resembling that of a unicorn. In melee, it will stab with its horn, etc. So where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from a mythological creature of Middle Eastern origin. You might have thought by the name, but also you might have just thought that name was just made up and not realized that it's actually coming from Earth folklore and history. Well, it's not history, it's folklore and mythology. But, and again, it's described very, very similarly. So it's described as a large rabbit with a 2-foot long horn, like that of a unicorn, and it lived on an island in the Indian Ocean. And it was very dangerous, and it can kill and eat creatures much larger than itself. So it's a little bit more aggressive than the one described in the Fiend Folio, but it's the same idea. And it's mentioned in this book called Marvels of Things Created and Miraculous Aspects of Things Existing. Sometimes that is shortened to be called The Wonders of Creation, but the literal translation of the book is that longer one that I read out. And this is a book that was written by a person, a very long name, and I'm not great at pronouncing names like this. I just don't have familiarity with the pronunciation, but I want to say it's Coswini or Coswini. But from around 1279 to 1280 AD, or Common Era, I guess, whatever the term is these days. So it was a book that was written, a compilation. And so Coswini wasn't necessarily writing and creating these stories, but was instead, some of them, yes, but was compiling things from other people. And some of the people he sources, there's like 50 people sourced in this book of like where the ideas came from, but there's a lot of unknown sources as well. And it includes cosmology in this book. So think, celestial, astrological, there's things about angels and heaven and stuff like that in this book. And then there's also terrestrial stuff. So it covers like the 4 elements. It covers the 7 climes, trees, rivers. There's a bestiary of the animal kingdom, and it's got flora, fauna, all that kind of stuff, including talking about like humans and genies, right? Or jinn, as they're called. And it was intended to kind of entertain readers by adding some substance and some kind of fun to the scientific explanations, and then kind of expanding on it with stories and poetry just to make it more interesting. So obviously the Almirage is not a real creature, but it's described in here as kind of like a fun, thing to like make the book, I guess, a little bit more interesting. And there's a thought that this tale of the Almirage is coming from an older tale about Alexander the Great defeating the serpent and then receiving the Almirage as a gift. So I just think that's really interesting. Now, that's right out the gate. I'm not going to spend this much time on each one of these, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of like how rich the history of the monsters in D&D are. And I bet most of you have never even used one of these in a campaign. But I remember, because it's, right here at the very beginning in the Fiend Folio, pretty much right out the gate alphabetically. I remember reading about this and looking at it and thinking it looked cool. I mean, a rabbit with a unicorn horn that can stab people with it. That's kind of a neat idea. So that's the Almirage. Now let's just keep going. This is going to be from the Monster Manual 2. This is going to be the Annis. Okay, and again, we're talking about different types of folklore and mythology that influence the creatures in Dungeons and Dragons. So here's the Annis you see here. And the Annis originally appears actually in module WG4, the Forgotten Temple of Thurisdan, which is from 1982. And then it's included here in the monster manual too. Now, the black anise, or the anise, the name is thought to come from this folklore of a woman called Black Agnes or Black Anna. And Annis is a female given name in Scotland. So it's kind of Scottish in origin, but or the name is. But Black Annis or Black Agnes, however you want to say it, is like a boogeyman type of figure in English or Scottish folklore, and described as a witch or a hag with iron claws. Okay, so, and you can kind of tell that from the photo or the illustration here. That's probably what this is. But what's interesting is there's varying or competing theories about where this comes from. So some people says like, oh, it's actually based on folklore. It's definitely based on these things. And then there's other people who say, no, it's based on a real person named Agnes Scott, who was like a nun who sort of secluded herself. And there were stories about, when the Protestants took over, they were trying to like scare people away from the Catholic Church. And so they made up the story about how this, Agnes Scott nun had become evil and, done all these horrible things. So who knows if that's really true, but there is a written reference to Black Annis in a 18th century title deed that referred to a parcel of land, which was called a close in Scotland. And it's called Black Annie's Bower Close. And so that's one of the theories of where this comes from. And then there's like this little poem here that was written. It says, "'Tis said the soul of mortal men recoiled to view Black Annis's eye, so fierce and wild. Vast talons, foul with human flesh, there grew. In place of hands and features, livid blue. Glared in her visage, whilst her obscene waist, warm skins of human victims closed embraced." So again, I think, I like adding that kind of flavor to these monsters to make them more than just a bag of hit points that you're out to kill, right? Having these sort of origin stories and knowing where it comes from in the real world can make it something that you can apply to your game. So even though this says that the Annis is, it's very rare, and it says the number appearing 1 to 3, what if there's just one in your whole world? And it's this one, and it is based on a real person in your campaign world that died long ago after committing some horrible crimes and now haunts whatever the area is. And I just think that makes it much more interesting and something that is, again, a little bit more creative than just having a whole species of these things. Then it kind of like removes the mystery, if that makes sense. Okay, but let's keep going. Go to a few more of these in the folklore section. And that's going to be the groaning spirit or banshee. Okay, now this is interesting, and it was actually really helpful for folks. In my last video, I mentioned how, so my last video was about the influence of the California designers on the history and evolution of Dungeons & Dragons, which honestly is like a really cool video. And I think a lot of people kind of ignored it or it didn't get pushed to them through the algorithm, but there's a lot of history in there about how important some of these early designers were in pushing the game of Dungeons and Dragons and just tabletop role-playing game design philosophy forward in a way that was very different than the people in the Midwest were doing it. So I encourage you to watch that. But in one of the publications or the supplements that we looked at, the Manual of Arania, they had some character types in there called the Sidhe. Sidhe. And I mentioned in the video, I wasn't sure how to pronounce it, but I thought it was she based on my understanding. And most people came in and said like, yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's pronounced she. And for whatever reason, I never connected this, that banshee, the way that we spell it in English. Well, that's based on that other spelling, the Sidhe. And it's like two separate words put together, banshee, to create like this wailing spirit. Right. So, I think that's cool and something I didn't know. So I thank all the people who commented on that and helped me understand that. But it is from Irish banshee and from Old Gaelic or Old Irish, and it means woman of the fairy mound, is my understanding. But the way that we spell it now kind of entered English in the 18th century. Now, it first appears here in the Monster Manual 1977, and again, it's labeled as the Groaning Spirit. Later, they're going to just change the name officially to Banshee, like it's got Banshee here in parentheses, as you see, if you're looking at the book, if you're watching instead of just listening. And it's Irish, so it's a female spirit whose wail was a portent that someone might soon die. Okay, and in Scottish lore, there's a similar type of things, and it was pronounced and spelled similarly, but Scottish instead of Irish. That was an omen of death. So again, we've only looked at 3 creatures here, and we've got one that is Arabic, we've got one that is Scottish, and then one that is Irish. Okay, well, let's keep going and look at the basilisk. So this is an interesting one because it is going to be listed here in the fantasy supplement for Chainmail as one of the monsters that people might fight. So you see it's here listed. It says basilisk. And then what's interesting is in parentheses, it says cockatrice. Now, Chainmail does that a lot. It like equates 2 different things. And sometimes it'll just say like, oh, it's just slightly different. So I know they do that with like trolls and ogres. You see that here. You've got lycanthropes and shape changers. So it's pretty common to do that in Chainmail, partly just to save space. But they put basilisk and cockatrice in the same listing here. So it goes all the way back to Chainmail as far as being part of the kind of Dungeons and Dragons like DNA of monsters. But it comes from Greek, basiliskos, which means little king. And it was known as a regulus in ancient Rome. And again, first appearing in Chainmail, and then it's going to come into original D&D, so the Monsters and Treasure book, volume 2 of the 3 booklets. And then, of course, it's going to be in the Monster Manual here from 1977. So it's been part of the game since the very beginning, and, actually predating Dungeons and Dragons as far as statistics coming from Chainmail. The stats are completely different because Chainmail is a different game system, but, similar kind of idea. Okay, so again, it's Greek in origin, and the 2 monsters, the basilisk and the cockatrice, they're actually they're very kind of intertwined, which is why they're listed together in Chainmail. Now, it's interesting that later on in Dungeons and Dragons, we're going to see them separated out. So you see here in the Monster Manual, for example, the cockatrice has its own listing here. And the drawing is pretty different because they're trying to differentiate what these 2 things look like. But in ancient mythology, they weren't always 2 different things. So some of the things that we've seen comes from a work written by Pliny the Elder in Rome around 77 AD called Natural History. And the quote is, "There is the same power also in the serpent called the basilisk. It is produced in the province of Cyrene, being not more than 12 fingers in length. It has a white spot on the head, strongly resembling a sort of diadem. When it hisses, all the other serpents fly from it, and it does not advance its body like the others by a succession of folds, but moves along upright and erect in the middle, upon the middle." So that's the basilisk. But now for the cockatrice, again, also in Chainmail, also in original D&D, also in the Monster Manual, it is interestingly enough mostly known as an English myth from the 12th century, but that reference in English comes from Pliny's Natural History. So they kind of diverge, which is why you see the 2 different sort of illustrations here in the Monster Manual, because people are describing them differently, even though kind of originally they were kind of the same thing, right? So you're having translation upon translation hundreds of years after the original thing was written. So it began to become synonymous with the basilisk, but not originally. And the first English mention in the 13th century is by John Wycliffe in a translation of Hebrew. I think it was asp and adder. And so those words get changed into cockatrice, okay? And the cockatrice is described as being created by a chicken egg that is then hatched by either a toad or a snake. So that's why you see kind of this, very different picture here for the cockatrice, even though it was originally related to the basilisk, because they're kind of differentiating them a little bit. Okay, so that's the cockatrice and the basilisk. Let's move on and talk about one of my favorites, the Catoblepas. That's how I pronounce it. I'm not sure that's how it's pronounced. It looks like it to me, Catoblepas. So Monster Manual 1977. However, it actually first appears in the Strategic Review number 7 from 1976. And then it's going to be come out in the Eldritch Wizardry supplement from 1976. So you see here, the gaze of these monsters penetrates both the astral plane and the ethereal plane, as well as the physical. So It's described here, officially first after the strategic review. So it's going to have two different appearances before it makes it into the 1977 Monster Manual. Okay, so where's this coming from? It's actually a creature from Ethiopia, interestingly enough. However, it's then described through Greek and then into first century Rome by our friend Pliny the Elder, who puts it in his natural history book. So it's described that way. But I also find it interesting, and if you watched that video on the California creators who influenced Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games, the Manual of Arania was also published in 1976. It was a publication that came out of the Aero Hobbies group here in Southern California, Santa Monica specifically. Aero Hobbies was a game store. And the reason that they're sort of, quote unquote famous is they're the people that created the Thief class that finds its way into the Greyhawk Supplement 1 and then eventually into Dungeons and Dragons, which now in 5th edition you call a rogue. It didn't originally exist in the original printing of Dungeons and Dragons. It was a later edition, and it came from an outside group here in California. And it's been a core part of the game ever since. So anyway, they were not happy. There's a whole story, and you should watch the video to understand why, but they were not happy that the Thief class got printed that way. And so they wrote a supplement and then published it, self-published, called the Manual of Arania. And it was all the other classes that they had, but it also had spells and monsters and things like that. Well, one of the monsters that was in there was a Catoblepas. Now, it's published in 1976. So it's the same year that Strategic Review is being published, that specific issue that had the Catoblepas number 7. And also Eldritch Wizardry is published in 1976. However, if you know publishing at all, things take months to get typeset and then copied and distributed and put out. So I don't know that the folks from the Manual of Arania were copying the Catoblepas from those, and I would guess strongly that they were not, because they were upset that their creation had been taken and put into Greyhawk and then was later going to be published in Dungeons and Dragons. So they didn't like that. So the chances of them copying something that TSR was doing in Strategic Review or in one of the supplements and republishing as their own is highly unlikely. So I think it's just a complete coincidence and a concurrent publication. But I find it interesting that it's a monster that I'd never heard of before, and you have two different groups of people that are drawing on this same kind of folklore wherever they got this information back then, because again, there was no internet, so they had to have access to books on mythology and folklore to find this, and then realize, it looks like a fun thing to include in our games. So that's the Catoblepas. Okay, and let's continue on with the next creature in our look, which is going to be this one from the Monster Manual 1977, and that's the Quaddle. Again, how I say it. Now, this is interesting. It actually first appears in Eldritch Wizardry, again, 1976. So a lot of our monsters are coming from this particular book. So you see here on page 38, it talks about wing-feathered serpents. So where does the Quaddle come from? Well, it's Mesoamerican. Okay, so Quetzalcoatl, it's named after Quetzalcoatl, who is a Mesoamerican deity and whose name translates to feathered serpent, which is why it looks like this, right? So the D&D appearance of the Quaddle here, it's falling very closely to the descriptions that we see when we read about Quetzalcoatl in ancient Mesoamerican myths and folklore. So now we've added yet another different source of folklore. And so I think it's, for me, as a kid, I loved this kind of stuff. And so I've known this for quite a while, but just the breadth of the folklore that D&D creators were drawing upon and the knowledge that they had of this kind of stuff to even think to include it in a game like this, again, I think is really, really cool. Okay, so now we're going to come to probably a favorite one of a lot of you folks, which is going to be it doesn't debut in here, but I'm going to show it in here. This is the Fiend Folio that I'm looking at if you're not watching right now. But this is going to be our friends, the Dark Elves, or Drow. Now, I'm going to say Drow because that's how I grew up saying it, and I can't say it any other way, just because I always, get confused if I try to say it the other way. I do know some people say Dro, and I think that technically based on the etymology of the word and where it comes from. So originally it comes from a Scottish word of DROW or TROW, and it's sort of a version of the word troll. And so if you're going to say troll, then the TROW is probably pronounced tro, which means the DROW would be pronounced dro. And I know a lot of people of you out there pronounce it dro. But again, just how I learned it, it's pronounced drow. Now, there's a whole pronunciation guide that Frank Menser wrote in the issue number 93 of Dragon Magazine back in the 80s. And where he goes through and basically tells you how to pronounce all these different words. And it's something I should probably refer to more often when I'm trying to pronounce some of these hard to pronounce monster names and stuff. But he very specifically says that you can pronounce DROW as either drow or dro. There's no right way to pronounce it. So either are correct. So I always see people do this, and I think this is hilarious. People say, like online especially, you'll say, how do you pronounce DROW? How to pronounce it? And then people will write back and say, oh, you pronounce it like the word BOW, which is hilarious because, of course, you can say bow or bow, and a lot of people don't get it. And they're like, but you can pronounce that either way. And it's like, that's the joke. It's like you can pronounce it either way. So in any event, I'm going to call them drow. Now, where do these come from? Well, this is an interesting one because it's actually going to go in a little bit of a different direction and appear first in this supplement, also from 1976. This is supplement 4, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, written by Rob Kuntz and Jim Ward. So Rob Kuntz, fortunately, still with us, still blogs and talks about Dungeons and Dragons and creates content, and publishes things, right? James Ward, unfortunately, passed away, I believe, in 2024. I did a tribute video to him. But there's going to be some mention in here, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, of the Dark Elves. So you see here, this is in the Norse mythology section. And here on page 31, it says, Dark Elves. These elves dwell beneath the earth and cause trouble for anyone wandering through their territories. They live and cause evil upon Svartalfheim. Svartalfheim. I've always said Svartalfheim. I guess I've never really looked at the pronunciation. But anyway, that's an early, very quick reference to Dark Elves in Dungeons and Dragons, in Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. Okay. Now, later on, the official version of the Drow or the Dark Elves are actually going to debut in module G3. This is G3, the Hall of the Fire Giant King, published in 1978. So the G modules, G1, G2, and G3, are the first 3 modules published by TSR, the first 3 adventures published by TSR in 1978, after other companies had kind of jumped and beaten them to the punch. Judges Guild and We Warriors, 2 of the most famous ones that had started publishing adventures when TSR was like, oh, hey, people will buy adventures that other people wrote. They don't want to just create it themselves. And so they jumped on the bandwagon with the G series. And interestingly enough, those first modules, they create what nowadays, that wasn't called this back then, but nowadays we would call them an adventure path, where each module or adventure is building on what happened before. And so there's the G1, 2, and 3 series, and then there's the D1, 2, and 3 series. And then ultimately, years later, 1981, it's going to culminate in Q1, Queen of the Demonwood Pits. So originally, G3 was published as a standalone adventure. It was like 8 pages or something, very, very short. I have a whole video where I talk about the G series of modules. But years later, it's going to be collected, all 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3 are going to be collected into the module G1, 2, 3, Against the Giants. That's the version I have. I do have the separate copies of G1 and 2. I just never got a separate one of G3. But in any event, this is the section on the Hall of the Fire Giant King for module G3 here at the back. And you see some fire giants there. But we're going to see the Drow or Dark Elf here at the back in the monster section. And this is where they debut. A lot of people think they debuted in D1, Descended to the Depths of the Earth. And I made that mistake once before as well. I just wasn't, double checking and didn't remember. And but it's actually, they debut in G3. Now, where do these come from? I mean, so it definitely comes from folklore and Norse folklore and more so. But interesting, Gary Gygax was asked where did they come from, and this is something that he mentioned in Dragon Magazine issue number 31. So he quotes, as he's quoting the article, and he says, "Drow are mentioned in Kitely's The Fairy Mythology, as I recall. It might have been the Secret Commonwealth. Neither book is before me, and it is not all that important anyway. And as dark elves of evil nature, they served as an ideal basis for the creation of a unique new mythos designed especially for the AD&D game." So the two books that he's talking about here, one, The Fairy Mythology by Kitely, was first published in the year 1828. And then The Secret Commonwealth is by Robert Kirk. That was originally published in 1691. So somehow Gary had access to these really old books. So he's writing in he would have been reading them, I assume, when he was younger, before. It's not like he's reading it right as D&D comes out. He grew up with this kind of stuff. I know that, I think there was a pretty big kind of library in his house, just, having a bunch of books. But having access to books like this that are so old, and I don't know how often they've been reprinted over the years. I know that they're easy to get now, but back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, how easy was it to get a hold of these books? I have no idea. So I just find it very, very interesting that somehow Gary had access to these, and he was able to call them up while he's writing this article about where the Dark Elves came from. Now, interestingly, and this is par for the course for Gary. If you've watched the channel before, Gary has a tendency to, let's say, revise some of the things that he says about where things come from and how they come about and things like that. And it's not always nefarious, folks. I've mentioned this many times before. One, if you just tell a story so often and you repeat it, pretty soon to you it becomes true, even if it's exaggerating or not telling the truth. And I'm not saying it's done on purpose. It's just human nature. The other ones, people forget. It happens, right? But anyway, he's interviewed years later. There's a very great source of interviews that you can get from Gary. There's a few of them, but the two main ones that I use are ones from Ian World, where he would just drop into the forum comments and people would ask him questions and he would answer them, right? And then the other one is from, I want to say it's RPG Net, where there was a series of interviews that are all collected there. So those are great sources of information. But anyway, in the one in Ian World, somebody asked him about the Drow, even though this article had already been written in Dragon Magazine. Presumably the person who asked the question hadn't seen that, right? Because at that point it was long out of print. So this would be like early 2000s when these are being asked. And so Gary says later that he took the term from a listing in the, quote, Funk and Wagnall's Unexpurgated Dictionary. And then he says, and no other source at all. So he's already said he took it from Kitely's Fairy Mythology or from the Secret Commonwealth, but he can't remember which. Now he's saying no, he just took the term from the Funk and Wagnall's Unexpurgated Dictionary. And he says, I wanted the most unusual race as the main power in the Underdark, so used the reference to Dark Elves from the dictionary to create the Drow. So now that's his new story that he's saying. Now, what's interesting is there is no Funk and Wagnall's Unexpurgated Dictionary. That doesn't exist. There's different versions of the Funk and Wagnall's dictionary. There's just not one called the Unexpurgated version. And a lot of them do list Drow / TROW, Tro, however you want to say that, right? And they talk about it. So he probably just made a mistake there, but it's, again, sometimes it's difficult because we want to use these firsthand quotes as like the real deal, like the actual knowledge of like, this is what happened. But when you add decades of time on top of that, we can't always rely on these quotes. We have to look at them with a little bit of a grain of salt and try to like find some more information. Well, also interestingly enough, there is a collection on Norse mythology called the Prose Edda. It's from 13th century Iceland, and it's widely considered to be like the, at the time, best compilation and explanation and detail about Norse mythology that ever, that existed, like, in the moment, right? And they are, dark elves are mentioned in there. And it says the dark elves, however, live below the ground and are blacker than pitch. Well, if you know the dark elves from D&D, this is the thing a lot of people complain about. They live underground and yet their skin is pitch black when technically it should be white, So like because they have no access to anything that would have caused them to have like sun or anything like that to have darker pigmentation. So, I don't know how all the physics and the physiology and all that kind of stuff works, but I've seen arguments made that creatures that live underground probably would have lighter skin, not darker skin. So the fact that Gary Gygax is, they are called dark elves, so I guess you would assume that they would have darker skin, maybe, but that doesn't have to be the case. But in any event, I think that's another fascinating story about. It's based a little bit on mythology and folklore, but you've also got these other sources coming into it, and then you have conflicting views about where this monster comes from. All right, let's keep going and talk about the next monster I wanted to chat about, which is the ghoul. Now, I have chatted about this a little bit before, but again, I just kind of want to give a sense of like the breadth of mythology that D&D is pulling from to bring these creatures in. So here's the picture of the ghoul from the Monster Manual 1977. And so the word ghoul, Ghoul, well, it comes from the Arabic word ghul, Ghul, which means to kind of snatch or grab or take away. But it also has a connotation in Arabic of being as kind of like a demonic type creature. So those of you who are familiar with the Batman comics, or I guess the movies like the Christopher Nolan movies, the character of Ra's al Ghul in those movies, well, that name Ra's al Ghul, at least in the Batman mythology, translates as the demon's head. Okay, so and he's the leader of the League of Shadows and the League of Assassins, like kind of two splinter organizations. But that's kind of like the connection to that word ghoul. So they first appear in chainmail. We saw that already. We were listing them when we went through our chainmail book here. But then they come into original D&D in Monsters and Treasure, and then they're going to be in the Monster Manual. And they're described as, from Arabic mythology as creatures that inhabit graveyards. They live in graveyards, and they eat and they feast on human flesh. And they're sort of like, noted to be a variety of jinn, like genies. Now, very interestingly enough, the D&D version of the ghoul, while the name is Arabic and some of the habits of the ghouls in D&D are related to the Arabic folklore, there's also another connection to H.P. Lovecraft and a story that he wrote called Pickman's Model, where ghouls are depicted as a race of sort of like subterranean cannibalistic creatures. And that is very much in line with the way that ghouls are described in D&D. So you have these kind of like cross-pollination of sources, I guess you could say. All right, now, the list of folklore just goes on and on. I'm not going to go through, any more, in detail. But just to give you, again, a sense of like all the different cultures that D&D draws from. You have the Burbalang from White Dwarf and Fiend Folio. Okay, that's Filipino in origin. You have dragon turtles in the Monster Manual. Those are from Chinese folklore and culture. You have the dragon from medieval heraldry. That first is going to appear in the Monster Manual, but it's coming from medieval European heraldry. You've got the Dwergar. I think this one's really cool. So if you're familiar with the Dwergar, those are the kind of the gray dwarves. They're the evil dwarves. It's kind of like the dwarf version of the drow, right? So the evil dwarfs here, the Dwergar. That comes very specifically from an area in England called Northumbria. Okay, and very specifically, they were known as the Simonside dwarfs, but also they were known as brown men or bogles. And they're first listed in a newspaper article, actually, in the Morpeth Gazette in 1889, and then in Tyndale's Legends and Folklore of Northumbria, which is from 1930. So it's a kind of more recent kind of folklore reference, but it's interesting that it's based on a very specific geographic area, and it finds its way into Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. And to me, again, I think that the amount of work that went into finding that and then writing it up and putting it without access to the internet is amazing. That's a feat just by itself to even know that these things existed. Okay. Then the giants obviously are coming from folklore, but it's not just the folklore that you're thinking of. It's like, Jack and the Beanstalk, like, oh, it's English folklore, Irish, Norse, Greek folklore, Central and Eastern European folklore. And then also like the stone giants are probably coming just from Tolkien. So they're not even stone, folklore related. Okay. So another fun one, I think, One of my favorite monsters from the Fiend Folio is I always have trouble pronouncing this one as well. The Hukuva or the Huakuva. So I didn't realize when I first read this. I remember reading the monster description when I was a kid. I'm just showing you the picture here if you're listening and not watching, from the Fiend Folio, 1981. That's actually based on an Argentinian legend from the Mapuche tribe, and it means the word that it is based on means evil spirit. And somehow the person that created this knew that and wrote this up. Again, just really cool for the time period, especially. You have the Lamsu, which is based on Akkadian and Sumerian folklore. And they first are going to appear in Greyhawk Supplement 1. But then they're also going to come into the monster manual, and the name basically they were like female protective deities in Akkadian and Sumerian folklore. You have something as simple as larva. So this is the monster manual from 1977, and you have the larva here. I just thought larva were sort of influenced or from just the name larva, like, flies, they, something dies and larva grows and then it turns into flies or like whatever. Well, no, larva actually is a Latin word for ghost-like, and they were restless and vengeful kind of Roman spirits of the dead. I had no idea that when I was a kid, and I was fascinated when I found that out, that that's where that word came from. And the reason why I think this is important is that it can give you so many ideas of how you can use these monsters differently if you didn't know that, right? So again, and I realize this folklore section is long. I just think it's really important because so many of the monsters in D&D are based on actual folklore. You've got Nagas from Malaysian folklore, Hindu and Buddhist folklore. They first debut in Strategic Review number 3. You've got Nixies, which I always thought, Nixie is just a made-up word that's like a water version of a pixie. Nope, completely different. Pixie is like a completely different culture. Nixies are actually Germanic. I think pixies, if memory serves, are Celtic. So Germanic, and they were female river mermaids, essentially. And those are going to be in original Dungeons & Dragons. One of my absolute favorite monsters from the Monster Manual, this undead thing, the Penangolin, that's how I'm going to pronounce this. It's just creepy. It's a flying head, woman screaming with all these entrails hanging out and things like that. Well, turns out that is based on a Malaysian folklore and mythology. And I think that's really cool. The Fiend Folio is really a diverse group of stuff, even though it was, coming out of monsters that were published in White Dwarf in England. It's not just based on English folklore. It's a very wide array of different cultures, just like the Monster Manual is before that, and original Dungeons and Dragons as well. You have the Rakshasa, the kind of tiger people. That's also Malaysian and Sanskrit, and they were malevolent spirits in Hindu and Buddhist folklore, debuting in Strategic Review number 5. You have the Sturge, a very difficult and tough monster. I think they get overlooked all the time, but you do not want to come across a Sturge if you are a first level character. My daughter's group ended up fighting a couple of these by accident. They didn't want to, and one of them almost died. It was very, very close. They were able to basically run away and get away from them. Fighting them was not an option because they didn't really have any ranged weapons, and the Sturges were too far away to engage in melee. But Sturge also did something I didn't know, comes from the Roman word striga, which comes from the Greek word strix, which means owl. And in Roman mythology, they were a bird of ill omen, and they eat human flesh and blood. And they first debut again in Greyhawk. You're going to see Greyhawk come up time and time again on here. And I've mentioned this so many times on the channel before, but Greyhawk is to me, single most important supplement in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, because it turns original Dungeons and Dragons and the way it was presented into the game that we more recognize today. And then another favorite of mine, the Tarrasque. So that's going to be from Monster Manual 2. And it, one of the toughest creatures in all of Dungeons and Dragons history. If you've seen my, shirt design that I made, that's called, I call it Dice and Dragons, but the it has a Tarrasque as one of the creatures. It's like the little characters are fighting a Tarrasque. That's what that is. And so here's the picture of the Trask from the Monster Manual too. Well, that actually comes from French folklore, southern France in the Provence region. And it was this creature that was so well armored, like knights created like all these different machines that they could use to attack it, and nothing worked. And it was tamed by a saint, Saint Martha. And she's the one that calmed it down, and they were able to later get rid of it. But there's definitely some connections to like kaiju, like monsters from like the Godzilla kind of Japanese entertainment, like these giant beast monster things. But again, the word and the name does come from folklore from Provence. Okay, so that's going to end up our folklore discussion here on the monsters and the origins of them. However, I would like to say that if you're interested in the folklore more, there was a very cool supplement that came out. This is by the Merry Mushmen. They're based in, I want to say France. I could be wrong. I know they're in Europe somewhere. I think it's France. But they put out this really cool book called A Folklore Bestiary. And you see mine here says Old School Essentials. It's designed for use with Old School Essentials, which is a kind of a retro clone that works with a 1981 Moldvay Cook Marsh BX Dungeons and Dragons. They also put out the exact same book as a 5e edition. So if you're a 5e player and you're interested in this, check out that one. You don't have to be, turned off because this was designed for a system that you don't use. But this is this collection of monsters from folklore all over the world, and it really goes deep. It goes deep into like these different cultures that, you're just maybe not used to. Like this one's from the Basque country. And this one you see here is from Lorraine, France. And let's look at another one here. Well, this one's from France, Italy, and Switzerland, it says. But they have just so many cool, this one's German. But they have some American ones in here as well, which I thought was really interesting. Some of them that I've never even heard of before. This one's from Kilkenny in Ireland. And anyway, I did a whole review of this book if you want to learn more, but this is a way to expand the folklore. And the presentation is great. I love the art, but it gives you all these stories and things how you can kind of integrate these monsters into your campaign. And I think it's a really cool supplement. So I would definitely check out that review, and I'll put a link to it here in the upper right-hand corner. Okay, let's go to our next bucket of origins, which is going to be Pulp Fiction stories and the Appendix N. Some of the stuff is going to, kind of get a little bit out of the Appendix N, but it's still going to be in that kind of pulp or early fiction type of influences. So let's start out with the carnivorous ape. So it probably doesn't sound that exciting to you, but they actually are kind of cool. And you see the carnivorous ape here in the 1977 Monster Manual. However, they actually are going to debut in the original D&D game here. Now, interestingly enough, this is not Monsters and Treasure Book 3. This is book 2. This is Book 3, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. And the reason that I have this is because we're going to see some wandering monster encounter tables. And we're going to see here that white apes are going to show up in this section of Monster Level 4. So it says white apes. Well, that's coming from, of course, the main influence is going to be from the John Carter of Mars stories, the Barsoom stories. But there's just a lot of giant apes throughout fiction. For whatever reason, they're not listed as an individual creature in Volume 2, Monsters and Treasure. There's one little note here where it says large insects or animals. And it says this category includes giant ants and prehistoric monsters. So, and it says also include this group are the optionally usable Martian, in quotes, animals such as apes, bants, throats, etc. So I guess that's where you could put the white ape is in that section. It's just not listed as a separate thing, but it is listed on the Wandering Monster Encounter tables in Book 3, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. But there's also carnivorous kind of apes in Robert E. Howard's Conan books. So you see the cover here. This is by Frank Frazetta, of course, famous. And now, here's what I think is really interesting. TSR publishes a game in 1974, the same year that Dungeons & Dragons comes out, called Warriors of Mars. And it was a game in a very similar vein. It straddles that line between like, is this a miniatures war game, or is it a what eventually we would call a role-playing game? Because of course we don't call Dungeons and Dragons, the original one, a role-playing game. It's fantastic medieval war games campaigns rules. So it's in that same vein. However, they're going to publish that without any kind of license whatsoever. So, and they make reference to all kinds of things coming out of Barsoom. And so they're going to be told, don't do that, which makes that Warriors of Mars game extremely rare to have because it wasn't out for very long. And they're going to go through, when I say they, I mean TSR, and strip out all references to anything Barsoom like. So the carnivorous ape that you see here, this is the version of the white ape that is redone to avoid any kind of like trademark violations. Okay, so I think that that's really kind of interesting. So you also have another one. This is going to be a classic D&D monster. It showed up in the D&D movie, if you saw that, which I will tell you, I had a ton of fun with that. I took my daughter's D&D group to play it. To watch it when it came out, and they had a blast. But a classic D&D creature, the Displacer Beast. Well, this is actually based, it first appears in Greyhawk, for one thing. So 1975, Supplement 1 Greyhawk. As I told you, this is going to be chock full of things that we associate with D&D to this day. Okay. And then it's going to appear in the Monster Manual here from 1977. But it's based on this monster called, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Coeurl. And this is from a story by A.E. Van Voigt called Black Destroyer that was published in Weird Tales, 1939. And in the story, there's a character that describes a thing called, again, a coral. You see the cover of the story here, so you can see it looks very much like the Displacer Beast. And in the story, the character describes it and says, it looks like nothing else than a big cat. If you forget those tentacles sticking out from its shoulders and make allowances for those monster forelegs. So it seems very clear that the Displacer Beast is based on that. The one thing that the coral doesn't have is the displacement effect, that defense mechanism. But other than that, it's pretty much a straight lift from that story. So then you have the Gnoll, which I love these. So let's check out the Gnoll. Now they do appear in Monsters and Treasure, Book 2. This is one of my favorite things from this book. Gnolls, a cross between gnomes and trolls. And then it does say, perhaps Lord Sunsony did not really make it all that clear. Okay, so what's he talking about when he says Lord Sunsony? And this is, again, very typical of the time. Gary's writing this, and he just assumes that you know who he's talking about. And for one thing, it's not, he says Sunsony. It's not Sunsony, it's Dunsany. So he's already made a typo, but he just assumes that you know what that means and what he's talking about. Well, what he's referring to is Lord Dunsany's The Book of Wonder, how Nuth would have practiced his art upon the Knolls, N-O-L-E-S. This is a book from 1912, I believe. And it describes creatures in there that are very much like Knolls. However, this gnome troll hybrid type of thing that's described in original D&D in 1974. Well, by the time we get to the Monster Manual from 1977, we're going to have a completely different description. So you see this creature here, and this looks very much more so like what we think trolls are, or gnolls are now, like the kind of hyena men. Okay, so Gary's completely changed the description and the illustration of how they look. I mean, there's no illustration in original D&D, but I like that idea of gnome and troll hybrids being done. And I think that brings to mind another thing that you can look at with some of these monsters is, well, I'll bring it up later. We'll talk about another one and the way I handled it in my game. Okay, so other inspirations from Appendix N and from Pulp Fiction. Well, we were just looking at the golems here. Well, the flesh golem, you could just tell from the illustration, that's going to be based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But more so than the book, actually the movies, as far as the way that the creature is described here in the book. But golems themselves have kind of a rich folkloric history. And like the clay golem specifically is based on Jewish folklore. So not fiction. Okay, it's more like folklore and mythology. All right, now a very interesting one is going to be again something that is a favorite of a lot of folks, and that's going to be these fellows here, the Mind Flayer, or the Illithid, as they're later on going to be called. So where do these come from? Well, it's based in some kind of pulp fiction, but not really any creature specifically. And this one is a little bit tough to track down. So they're first going to debut in Strategic Review, #1 from 1975. And you see, of course, they're going to be here in the Monster Manual from 1977. Now, one of the things that Gary Gygax said, and again, this is one of the interviews that he did on EN World, or one of the forum posts that he made. And he said, "The Mind Flayer I made up out of whole cloth using my imagination, but inspired by the cover of Brian Lumley's novel and paperback edition, The Burrowers Beneath." And I have talked about this before, but if you see the cover here, you see these like tentacle things coming up out of the ground. And Gary was saying that he was influenced by that. Well, I mean, that's cool and all. And there is like a kind of a Cthulhu, Lovecraftian, cosmic horror vibe to that book with these tentacle things. But that's not a creature that looks anything like the Mind Flayer, other than like the Mind Flayer has tentacles growing out of kind of like its chin, you know, or whatever part of the face you want to call that. It doesn't really look like that. Well, I think this is very interesting. And this is, again, I found this on the blog from DM David, and he did some research and discovered another book by Brian Lumley, same author, but called The Collar of the Black. And if you see this cover here, and DM David says, if you look at the character in the upper right-hand corner, that actually looks much more like the way that we envision the Mind Flayer as shown here in the Monster Manual than this Burrowers Beneath thing that just has these random tentacles and nothing attached to it. And so I'm wondering if when Gary said that, he just didn't remember the name of the book. Maybe he'd read both, and maybe he was referring to the Collar of the Black. I think that could make a lot of sense, but, you know, Gary said it was from the Burrowers Beneath. So Gary goes on in that interview to say, or it's not an interview, he's just answering questions. Okay. And he says, "Now, what sort of nasty bastard is that? So without a qualm, I made up the Illithid, the dreaded Mind Flayer, so as to keep the players on their toes or have their PCs turn theirs upwards." So that is the, you know, origin of the Mind Flayer. Now, there's a lot of other fictional influences. Obviously, there's all the Tolkien stuff. I'm not going to get into the orcs and wargs and you know, the treants. We've talked about a lot of those, right? The Baelor coming from the Balrog, and etc. Like even halflings, you know, and hobbits, right? But some other fictional ones you might not be aware of, but things like the brain mole here in the Monster Manual. So there's the brain mole, and you also have the cerebral parasite in the Monster Manual from 1977. Well, those are thought to be based perhaps on a story called The Mind Parasites by Arthur Barker. It's kind of a Cthulhu type story and that mythos kind of thing, cosmic horror type of story. Okay. You also have another classic D&D monster. You've got the Periton, however you want to say that. Here, this is the Monster Manual from 1977 again. Now, that creature actually is mentioned in a book by Jorge Luis Borges, Book of Imaginary Beings, Borges, I'm not sure, from 1957. And so some people think that was the inspiration for this creature. That one's a little bit unclear. That's kind of like the best guess people have. But anyway, it finds its way into the Monster Manual, and it appears to have been based on like some kind of sources of fiction, and from that kind of thing that Gary Gygax was really into. So those are just some of the fictional resources. Again, I'm not obviously doing every monster, just some of the big ones. Okay, now next up, we're going to be looking at sort of like the pop culture, talking about some toys and some comic books and things like that influence some of the creatures in D&D. But before we do that really quick, I'd just like to ask you that if you would like to support my channel and the amount of effort that I put into making these videos, then there's 3 ways that you can do that right now. You can become a super fan and join all these other fine folks here. Just hit that heart icon with the little $ in it. You'll get your name listed here in the next video once you do that. And it's like for perpetuity. So once you do it, the list is just gonna keep building. And you just donate right here through YouTube, and that is a great way to help me do things like upgrade equipment and like, you know, the new microphone I got a little while ago, and also just kind of help me keep going, allow me to put time into making the videos rather than having to do other things. Okay, another thing that you can do is visit my shop. And now I have two shops. So if you're looking for something like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, or tote bag, you can get that from my spread shop. And then if you would like to get something like a sticker or a poster, or I think it's become kind of a favorite, is the notebooks. A lot of people are buying these ones. So you can get a notebook in either spiral bound or like a hardcover journal. And you can decide to get either blank paper or lined paper, or you can get graph paper. So the graph paper obviously would be very useful for drawing dungeons and mapping and things during a game. And all of these designs are things that I have created especially for fans like you, people who are fans of old school games. So I love the dice patent designs, and those have been pretty popular. And these are the actual patents, US patents for all the different dice other than the D6. And a variety of different options that you can get those if you are interested in those types of designs. I think they look great as a poster, like in your game room or on a notebook or a mug. But I also have designs for like people, fans of old school role playing games, like the classic classes or the ability scores that are listed in the original order. So strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma. I know originally constitution came before dexterity, but by the time I started playing, constitution and dexterity had swapped. So I have all those designs, and you can find those at links below. And then the last thing you can do, of course, is to buy my supplement, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. I wrote this specifically for 1981 BX D&D and Old School Essentials, as you see on the back here. And this is a book designed to help expand options for characters and campaigns for like experts in the game. So it's got 15 different backgrounds. So there's small tweaks to the character classes. It's got dozens and dozens of random tables to add some variety to your game. It's got 3 new character classes: alchemists, demolitionists, and inventors. It's got new pages of equipment. It's got a 3-story guild hall with NPCs and secrets and intrigue and rumors and all kinds of stuff, more random tables, and then advice for running an expert-themed campaign. So you can get this at Drive-Thru RPG as either a PDF or as a print-on-demand softcover, and it comes in either a parchment-style background, if you prefer that, or a plain white background. So I was looking to see like which one have people preferred the most, and it's almost exactly tied. So there doesn't seem to be any specific thing that people are preferring more than the other, but that's why you have a choice. So definitely check that out, and thank you so much for your support. A couple more appendix and references that I wanted to mention really quickly are our friend here, the Green Slime. So this is the version from the Monster Manual in 1977. There is a very famous book, one of my favorite books, from the Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's also listed as an inspiration for the Gamma World game that came out in 1978. And if memory serves, I think it's the only book that appears in both of those sources as an inspiration. And that is this book, Hero's Journey by Sterling Lanier. And I believe it was published originally in 1973. But it is a post-apocalyptic book, and I loved it because I was a huge fan of Gamma World back in the day. And this one really gets into like how society is being rebuilt and these different nations and cultures and all the different mutants. And one of my favorite things in this book is at the end, there's this really cool glossography where it defines all these different monsters and terms and nations and cultures and religions and all that kind of stuff that you see in the book. But what's in here is something that is almost 100% identical to the green slime that we see in Dungeons & Dragons, down to the idea that you have to burn it with fire in order to get rid of it. So I would assume that that is very clearly an inspiration, again, because as a post-apocalyptic book, it is listed as an inspiration for Dungeons & Dragons. Now, there's other D&D related things in here as well, including there's like a straight up classic example of a dungeon crawl at the very end of this book, Hero's Journey. And it's very much in the D&D style, again, even though it is in a post-apocalyptic setting. Now, speaking of fire burning things, let's flip over to the Troll, which, appears in earlier versions of D&D going all the way back, even pre-D&D, appearing in Blackmoor and in Chainmail. But the Troll, it mentions, are vulnerable to fire. It's one of the only ways that you can attack them. Well, where does that come from? This book, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by Paul Anderson, classic appendix and story. Also the model for the Paladin class, and so many other things in Dungeons and Dragons. I'm just picking one specific one, which is the trolls in Three Hearts and Three Lions are killed by fire. Okay, so more appendix and resources. Let's go on to some of these pop culture references that I was talking about. Now, most of these are going to come out of a single source, which is a bag of toys that were purchased by Gary Gygax, I believe, at probably like a dime store or something like that. And they were labeled as prehistoric, animals or monsters or whatever it was. And this picture here is from the artist Tony DiTerlizzi, who did a ton of work for the Monstrous Manual for second edition 1993 Dungeons and Dragons, and was like the artist for the Planescape setting. So the Planescape setting, its aesthetic comes from the art by Tony DiTerlizzi. But he wrote a whole post about these monsters, and it's become relatively well known that, the short version of the story is that they were playing with miniatures back then, because again, Dungeons and Dragons starts out sort of as a miniatures war game that evolves into incorporating role-playing elements to then just becoming focused on role-playing. But they needed miniatures to represent the monsters that they had, and back then there weren't miniatures for that. So at the start of it, you've got miniatures for knights and horses, and your typical battlefield things that you would find in a medieval type war game. But there were no monsters. So that's why that Gertie the dragon that I showed earlier, Dave Arneson had to make that from scratch because it didn't exist. So I believe he used modeling clay and made that dragon in order to have something to represent Gertie in his game. So Gary goes to the store, finds this bag of prehistoric monsters, which, by the way, look nothing like the prehistoric animals that we know existed. These came out of Hong Kong, and they seem to be very influenced by Japanese cinema entertainment and like those kaiju that we talked about briefly before. But these toys are pretty much directly responsible for at least three classic D&D monsters. And that's going to be the Boulette, or as Tim Kask says, he says that they called it the Boulet because they were trying to make it sound French, but he said it was sort of like they were trying to be funny, and so they called it the Boulet. But I've also heard that people just called it Bullet because that's what it looks like, or the Boulette. But in any event, that was one of the creatures that came for this. So Gary Gygax does say, this is from an RPG Net interview, and he says, I haunted the dime stores looking for potential additions and eventually found figures to represent ogres, elementals, etc. And so he's talking about, obviously ogres and elementals, but he's acknowledging the fact that he was trolling through the dime stores to find things to represent the monsters that he needed. So the Bulette is actually going to first appear in Dragon Magazine #1, and I talked all about it in there. So again, if you watch the History of Dragon Magazine playlist, you're going to find the origin of a lot of these monsters, or at least not their origin as much as like their first appearance before they became part of the D&D canon. And then obviously it's going to appear in the Monster Manual here. And so basically for this one specifically, Tim Kask at the time was the editor of Dragon Magazine. He had been hired to edit Strategic Review toward the very end of its run. And they've decided at this point to shift from Strategic Review into calling it The Dragon and kind of redoing everything. I've talked all about that. And they needed a space filler. And Gary went to Tim and told him to write up the Boulette or the Boulet as a feature in Dragon Magazine. And it becomes part of something they call the Creature Feature. And it is in Dragon Magazine #1. That's where it appeared. Now, my understanding is that it was essentially used as like a corridor sort of cleaner, in the sense of like because it was almost as wide as the corridor was wide, and it would run through the corridor and basically make all the PCs scatter and like run away from it. So kind of like bowl over them. And also from the time period, if you're familiar with classic Saturday Night Live sketches, you'll know the land shark, the Candy Graham sketch where the shark comes to the door and knocks. He says, Candy Graham. And, the woman on the other end is like, are you sure? You sound like a shark or like whatever. And he's like, no, I'm a dolphin. And she opens the door and, he eats her. I guess spoilers if you've never seen the sketch, but it was a classic funny sketch that ran for quite a while on SNL. So that was another inspiration for the Boulette. It looks like a land shark. Okay, but also we've got the owlbear, and you can see it's pretty close-ish to the drawing that we're going to see for the owlbear as it appears in the Monster Manual from these toys. Okay, including even sort of the flat kind of head at the top is similar to the toy that it seems to have been based on. But, owlbears first appear in Greyhawk, Supplement 1. And then the Rust Monster. So this is the most weird one, because this toy, why was there a toy in this pack of prehistoric monsters that has a propeller on its tail? I assume it was partially miscommunication, and it also partially might have just been like the limitations at the time, and that's not really a propeller. There are monsters, or there were prehistoric, either dinosaurs or other animals, I get mostly dinosaurs, that had kind of like a club type of tail that if you squint, you could kind of see like maybe that's what they were trying to do, but it straight up looks like a propeller. So for the Rust Monster specifically, again, it's going to debut in Greyhawk Supplement 1. But Gary says that the toy did not have any like teeth or claws or anything like that. And so he was trying to figure out what to do with it. And he was inspired by the ideas that they'd been coming up with of undead draining levels. Back then in undead, if you're, coming from 5e or 3e, where undead just kind of take hit points or maybe there's like a limited, time period of being reduced in power when you face them. In original D&D up through like, first and second edition, certain types of undead, when they hit you, they actually drained life levels, which means you lost experience points. So you might be 5th level and you get hit by a vampire or something, and you are reduced down to 4th level, and you have to reduce everything, including your spell casting and your hit points and anything that you gained over that last level. Not items, but like any physical or mental stats that had changed as a result of going up in level, or class abilities, right? So that was a big deal. And so Gary said, well, I don't want this thing to drain levels, but he thought, what's the other thing that characters really care about? And that is the items and the treasure that they have, gained over the course of adventuring. And so he thought the Rust Monster could take that away by, reducing the effectiveness or destroying their magic weapons and armor. And that would have been a big deal back then, to like, after everything you've done to like gain this +1 sword or +2 sword, having a Rust Monster come along and destroy it. So Rust Monsters are super scary. As a first level character, even you wouldn't even want to run into one, but especially if you've got these hard earned magic items. So that's essentially where the Rust Monster came from this toy, and also the inspiration for making it have the powers that it did, given that it didn't look like it had any offensive capabilities with the toy. Now, just one other pop culture thing really quickly. And again, there's tons of these. I'm just going over a few main ones. But there's this one over here, also in the Monster Manual. It's going to debut in Strategic Review number 3. And that's this, the Shambling Mound. Now, if you look at it, you can kind of get a sense that it is probably inspired by some comic books, and you would be right. So things like Swamp Thing and from DC Comics, and then Man Thing from Marvel Comics. Now, the origin on this is like, as far as who created it, is a little muddied. Rob Kuntz says that it was basically, seems like it was a combined effort. So he says that like he and Gary kind of created it, or like worked on it as part of an adventure called Journey to the City of the Gods. But that adventure was DM'd for them by Dave. So this is when, everyone's getting along at the very beginnings of things. And so it looks like they all three must have had a hand in creating this. But he does say that it was inspired by these Marvel and DC comics, which is kind of cool. So Swamp Thing I'm not as familiar with Man Thing. I'm more of a DC guy, but Swamp Thing is a pretty cool character. So I thought it was neat that he was in there. Now, there's some things that are created just specifically for D&D, and then the origin of those, as far as like what inspired it, is not always clear, or it's just completely unknown. So one of the most famous and iconic is going to be this one here, the Beholder, which debuts in Greyhawk Supplement 1, 1975. Okay, so this is the Beholder, and this looks like it was created, or it is created, by Rob Kuntz's brother, Terry. Terry played a character called Terrik, Terrik. It was one of the famous early NPCs in the Greyhawk campaign. And, remember, Rob Kuntz is co-DMing Greyhawk with Gary because there are so many players. So they're kind of like sharing the DMing job, taking turns depending on like who has time and which groups we're adventuring, that kind of thing. Okay, so Terry ends up creating this the Beholder originally was called the Eye of Doom. And Gary says on Ian World, and he definitely gives credit to Terry. He says Terry Kuntz was the primary creator of the Beholder. And then he says he has no idea. He has no idea where the idea came from, why he created it, like what was the inspiration. He says, except maybe he was a glutton for having his PCs punished. And he says, all I did was detail the monster and polish the concept, one that is an excellent one for sure. And then he said the pun was unintended by Terry, that it was called the Beholder. He said he just chose the term because of the number of eyes the critter possessed, as far as I can ascertain. And then later on, so he says that he kind of like, he detailed and polished the concept. Later on, he's going to say that he didn't really have to do all that much. It was pretty much ready to go. I mean, maybe he had to stat it differently or whatever, put it in the format that it's going to end up in the game, but that it was pretty much ready to go. So that's the Beholder. And it's fun if you see, look through, different periods of time of D&D, how the Beholder has changed from this kind of goofy looking thing here. There's a classic painting from a Dragon magazine cover that was like a Valentine's issue where there's a guy like on his knee with flowers. Looks like he's proposing to a female Beholder. It's really funny. It gets more and more teethy and crazy looking as time goes on, and it kind of loses a little bit of its charm, at least to me. But that's the Beholder. Now, the Blink Dog first appears in Greyhawk also, and in the Monster Manual. And it was created by Gary Gygax and Rob Kuntz. And we are guessing that because it appears in Greyhawk, which is credited to both of them. So I don't know if one of them was more responsible than the other. But the Blink Dog kind of in the same realm as the Displacer Beast, but sort of like a good version, I guess you could say. And my understanding is that Gary and or Rob were inspired by like African wild dogs and dingoes. Okay, so that's the Blink Dog. Now the Carrion Crawler one is fun. Another classic low-level-ish D&D monster. The Carrion Crawler here, you see the picture from the Monster Manual. And it first appears, guess where? Greyhawk. Okay, and so basically the idea of the Carrion Crawler was I talked about how Gary was running these games with so many people in Greyhawk, as is Rob. They're sharing. And Gary was running games 7 days a week. Okay, and he's like, during weekends, the adventuring parties would include like upwards of like 20 people in these games. And they all, and then they've got hirelings and henchmen and all this kind of stuff. So tons of people moving through these dungeons. And then on top of Gary running those 7 days a week, Rob is running sessions concurrently, but, separately, right? And so all those expeditions, they're all going into Castle Greyhawk. So I talked all about this before. I think it was in my video on the forgotten rules that actually made D&D better back in the day. But these ideas of like the real life timekeeping, the one for one time, which is that when you're not in the dungeon with your party, time still goes by at the same rate that it passes in the real world. And the reason for this is because you have all these different adventuring parties adventuring at the same time in these dungeons, and there's chances they could run into each other. But the real idea was that, well, if I have more time to adventure and I go down in there, I might find the treasure, and then by the time you get there, it won't be there. And so it was very important to understand who got there first, and then knowing what was happening and who was left and what treasure was left, but also what monsters had been fought and also what characters had died. And so the thing that Gary talks about, he says, is that when they had an encounter that was eliminated, a monster or something, he would like make a line to kind of say like, okay, this is done. Like this is not there anymore, so that he would remember that monster was no longer there when the next group came through. And then he said he'd give Rob details of like, this is what happened, so that Rob would also know these monsters are gone, these characters died, these monsters died, whatever it was, this treasure's missing. And then he said it occurred to him that you've got these different adventuring parties going down there, and their hirelings are dying, their henchmen are dying, the characters are dying, but also the monsters are dying. And he's like, he didn't want to have a dungeon full of rotting corpses. And so he created the Carrion Crawler specifically to move through and clean out the dungeon so that it wasn't full of rotting dead bodies. I think that's really funny. Just the way the game was played back then and how differently it was played than it is now, how that ended up helping create a brand new monster, the Carrion Crawler. Now, one of my favorite monsters from the Fiend Folio, probably a favorite of a lot of people, is going to be the Death Knight. Okay, now this is created by Charles Stross, who is a science fiction author, very famous science fiction author. He wrote monsters for for White Dwarf, and a lot of them made it into the Fiend Folio, as well as ones that he created specifically for the Fiend Folio. So it is an original creation. Like I said, he's British, and mostly known, interestingly enough, for writing science fiction and space opera, not fantasy. But he creates these Death Knights. Now, here's what's interesting about the Death Knight. I mean, if you think about it, it's sort of like an anti-paladin, right? It's an undead, chaotic, evil knight, it says. And then the very first sentence, the Death Knight, and there are only 12 of these dreadful creatures known to exist. So one of the things I think is interesting there, and I don't know if this was deliberate, but it seems pretty close. There are the stories of Charlemagne and his paladins. The 12 peers of Charlemagne are the 12 paladins of Charlemagne. And so those were like the good people of real world history of, or, a little bit of mythology and folklore of Charlemagne having his 12 peers or his 12 knights, his 12 paladins. And then you've got the Death Knights and it says there's only 12. I think that's really cool. And I'm wondering if that was the inspiration for saying that there's only 12. Also, I love the idea that there's a fixed number of these. There's never going to be any more. There are 12. Or maybe if one of them is destroyed, does that mean that a new one can be created? Again, this is all creating like world lore that you can use in your campaign setting. Right. Besides just having an army of these things that are irreplaceable. OK, so then the Githyanki. Let's talk about them. Classic drawing here on the front by I think the artist's name is Emmanuel. But the Githyanki debut in here also created by Charles Stross, that same author that we were just talking about. Well, he gets the name from a story that was written by George R.R. Martin of the Song of Ice and Fire fame. Called Dying of the Light from 1977. However, Charles Stross is going to take it and then like do something kind of different with it, even though it's sort of based on this idea. So in Martin's story, they're not developed very well, but it is mentioned that they are former slaves of an alien race. Well, Charles Stross is going to be also influenced by the work of Larry Niven called World of Patavs. And in that story, there's an ancient telepathic race known as the Thrent that once ruled sort of like an interplanetary empire through mind control, and they enslaved other races. And so he takes those two ideas and mixes it together and creates the Githyanki. But the name Githyanki comes from Martin, and Charles Stross unfortunately didn't credit him in here. And later on, he's like, I totally should have credited him. And, credit where credit's due. That's where the name came from. And so I guess he felt a little bad that he hadn't done that. But that's the Githyanki. So I think that's kind of interesting. That's got two different kind of literary sources to create that. And since we're talking about Charles Stross, we might as well do the trifecta here and look at another one of his very famous creations, which are the Slod or Slad. I usually said Slod, but it's Slaad, so I think it might be Slad. But they first appear here in the Fiend Folio, 1981. And he says, basically, this is a funny one. He says, well, the fact that I was running a fever when I came up with the Sladdy is probably not going to surprise anyone. Think of him as my independent exploration of Lovecraftians. And then he says, I didn't discover H.P. Lovecraft until a couple of years later. And then he says, think of Lovecraft mythos as invented by someone who hadn't read Lovecraft or even heard of him. The Sladdy were going to be basically representatives of and devotees of total chaos, with the added warp sense of humor. So that's the Sladdy, and our last entry in our for today of looking at some of the monsters that were created specifically for D&D without any necessarily like other inspirations for how they were created. Now, last up, really quickly, I just want to talk about some disputed or some kind of like unknown inspirations. So we talked about puddings and slimes at the beginning and how Dave Arneson used these quite a bit in his games. I have read a quote somewhere that someone said that I think it was actually Gary who said that creating the black pudding for D&D was a Dave Arneson creation, and he said that he created it because Dave Arneson hated like the English food black pudding, and so this was like his little joke to make it as a monster. However, I think Rob Kuntz says no, Gary created all the puddings and slimes. So again, I think it's a little bit unclear who did what. It seems like they kind of were influenced by the movie The Blob coming out in like the 1950s, but who knows? You have the gelatinous cube. This is another one. Looks like, it was created by Gary, and it looks like the idea again was to have that kind of like dungeon cleaner thing, moving through and cleaning things up, sort of very similar in vein to like the Carrion Crawler. But some people have said that it was probably or maybe inspired by a pulp story in Weird Tales called The Destroying Horde. And so one of the quotes in there is a tale of giant one-celled organisms, or I guess this is a description of the book. A tale of giant one-celled organisms spawned in a chemist's laboratory and an orgy of hideous death. So you have that gelatinous cube. You've got the intellect devourer. We kind of talked about that before, and being inspired by that other pulp story. You've got the lurker above. Strategic Review, number 3, and the Monster Manual. Some of these look like they might have been inspired by specific stories, but it's not always really clear which ones. You've got the Modrons here in the Fiend Folio. These are designed by Francois Marcel Freudeval. And if you don't know him, well, first off, he just recently passed away, which is sad. Sorry, the Modrons in Monster Manual 2, not Fiend Folio. But he was one of Gary's kind of like proteges and worked very closely with Frank Menser. And it turns out the original manuscript for the 1985 release of Oriental Ventures for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was originally being worked on by Francois. And then it later got changed and it was completely rewritten by Dave Cook. There's whole issues about that and why that happened and things. And, you can watch my video on Oriental Ventures if you want to learn more. But, Francois is going to create the Modrons, and it looks like they might have been inspired by a story by A. Merritt. A. Merritt is listed among the influential authors in the Appendix N for Dungeon Master's Guide. But he wrote a story called The Metal Monster in 1920. And in there, there's a character that controls animated, sort of geometrically shaped metal creatures that are like, they're cubes or tetrahedrons or whatever they are. So that is possibly an inspiration for the Modrons. I never really liked the Modrons. I thought they just looked goofy. But my understanding is, I didn't play a lot of Planescape, but I think they get kind of a better place in Planescape where it might make more sense. Okay, so then you've got the Purple Worm, first appearing all the way back in Chainmail. Okay, and then in original D&D and the Monster Manual. And the origins of these, they're claimed to be unknown. However, I think they bear a lot of resemblance to the sandworms from Dune. I don't know how people can't see that. But there's also, in Chainmail, they are described as kind of like a flightless dragon. I believe they're listed as like mottled or purple dragons. And eventually that's going to change over time where they're moved away from being part of the dragon family and moved into being part of like the worm family. And it's different. They're, flightless dragons, right? And then you've got the Umber Hulk. So the word umber comes from a French word, which translated from Latin, which means shadow or shade. Okay, umbra in Latin. And they first appear in, of course, Greyhawk in Monster Manual. But the thought is like maybe they were also based on another toy or Japanese kaiju. I've also heard people say that it might have come from an Ultraman show or cartoon. Not cartoon, but Ultraman from the 1960s. So black and white Japanese entertainment show. And so that's, again, I know it's not quick because it's a long video, but you can see we barely went through, not even a tenth of the monsters that exist in Dungeons and Dragons to try to talk about these origins. But I think it's important, again, to understand where these inspirations come from. And also, I think this serves as a good lesson for us that we can find inspiration anywhere to create the kinds of things that we want to create. You don't have to create it from just out of your head to be creative. You can take something that you've seen from a book or a movie or a comic or a toy or from a song or whatever it is, something that you see every day, and use that as the basis for stuff that you include in your game. So don't be limited by just looking at fantasy fiction or whatever as your inspirations. You can find that anywhere. And let me know. I hope that you enjoyed this, and let me know in the comments, again, if there's a monster I missed that you want to know more about, or if you think that this is worthy of a follow-up. Are there other monsters that I should have covered and I can kind of do like a part 2 down the road? I would love to hear about that. So definitely leave all that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places in the show notes where you can join me on social media and follow my blog. There's links to all those things I've talked about before, all the other blogs and resources that I looked at, as well as my shop and my drive-through RPG link. So that's all going to be down below in the show notes. And definitely check those out. And again, I hope that you enjoyed the video. And until next time, happy gaming, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time. Okay, and now for the bonus content. But before we get to the drinking and listening, I'm just going to do a quick mailbox update. But I got my issue of Carcass Crawler, which is the official Old School Essentials zine. I got it in the mail just a couple days ago. So this is issue number 5. And you see the cover here, which I quite like. And then this is a description of what's in here. We have changelings and rattlings, which are presented as character classes in the traditional BX style. But then they also use the advanced fantasy rules from Old School Essentials Advanced Fantasy to break out the changeling and rattling into separate races if you're a person who prefers the race and class as opposed to race as class. Okay, and then there's also some new lake and river monsters. And then there's a short adventure up Chaos River, which uses those new monsters that they put in here. There's level 0 characters. If you like that kind of DCC funnel approach, you can now do that using this issue of Carcass Crawler. And then there's cantrips, 0 level spells. And, that's something new because those don't exist in the 1981 BX rules upon which Old School Essentials is based. And then it has new poisons and special materials. So definitely check this out. I pre-ordered it or whatever, but you can get it now as a PDF or as a PO. It's not a POD. I think it's just printed normally. It's distributed by Exalted Funeral. And as you see, this is issue number 5. I think all of the previous issues, except for issue 0, which was a Kickstarter exclusive, but I think the other issues are available at least as PDFs. And I know Exalted Funeral has issues of, or has copies of issue number 4 as hard copies because I got an email from them. I already have it, but I got that. So I don't know if the other like issues 1 through 3 also are available currently as hard copies. But I love these little zines. They're not very long. What is this? 32 pages, but lots of ideas to expand your Old School Essentials campaign. Okay. So that's that. Now, let's get to the drinking and listening. So here's the album I have, and then this is going to be pretty special. So, and as you can see, this bottle is closed. So this is a little bit of a cheat because I actually wasn't drinking this when I worked on my notes for this video. This is a little bit different. I was thinking about having this, and I thought it might be fun to just open it for the first time here on the channel and share it with you guys. So I got this years ago when I went to visit my friend. I have a friend here from Southern California who moved back east to go to school at George Washington University, and he stayed out there. So he lives in the Virginia area, in the DC Beltway, but in Virginia. And years ago, we went out there because my dad, before he passed away, this is way back, 2016, I believe it was, my dad was still working, interestingly, at the time. And he got a consulting job out at a company in Richmond, Virginia. And so he was out there with his wife and wasn't able to make it home for Thanksgiving. And so my wife and daughter and I took a trip out to visit him in Richmond and have Thanksgiving with them. But while we were out there, we also drove up to visit my friend in the Northern Virginia area. And we went and took my daughter to go visit Mount Vernon. And while we were there, I saw this bottle of whiskey. So this is a smaller bottle, 375. And this is George Washington's Straight Rye Whiskey, historic recipe. So I've had this for almost 10 years and I haven't had it yet because one of those things I was waiting for a special occasion and then realized that as I'm getting older, there's no point in holding on to this stuff. A special occasion can be, I want to open a glass and share it and taste it with you guys on the channel. So there you go. So it talks about the history of distilling on Mount Vernon and that this was aged for 2 years in charred American oak barrels. And it's a small batch whiskey handcrafted using Washington's reconstructed distillery. So the original distillery is long gone, but they did reconstruct it in the original manner. And it uses the original methods for making the whiskey. So they're not using modern methods. And they used his mash bill of 60% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. And they got some locally sourced grains and they have a water-powered grist mill. And then they fermented the mash in wooden tubs and used copper pot stills heated by wood fires to produce this. And you see this is from year 2016, and this is bottle 1402. So this says aged 2 years. And then you see down here, it's aged, it's year 2016. Once you put it in the bottle, it's not going to age anymore. So it's not going to really, it shouldn't affect the flavor. It should taste exactly the way that it tasted when they first put it into the mash or, into the bottle. Okay. So we got the plastic off, the cap, cork, I guess I should say. And I'm using a Scotch tasting glass because that's what was easiest to grab. And so I'm just going to do a little bit here. Very light color. It's kind of hard to see because my desk is gray, but so it's probably making it look a little darker than it really is. You can smell all the way back here. Wow. Yeah, lots of like apple or pear, maybe, yeah. Um, Very fruity. A little baking spice. Very limited oak. Not much oak at all. There is kind of a like smoky or maybe leather. Okay, well, anyway, let's give it a little taste here. Oh yeah, it's very fruit forward, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm interestingly enough, I'm not getting the spice like the rye spice that I typically get from a rye. And this is 65% or 60% rye, but I'm not really getting that too much. Definitely that baking spice is coming through. And then there's like a nuttiness. What is that? Mm, yeah, like pecan maybe, but like apricot, like stone fruit, which is interesting because I was getting apple and pear on the nose. Um, but that's really smooth. It's very easy drinking. I forgot to look at the ABV. Let's check that out. Let's see what we have here. Um, 43% alcohol, so that's an 86 proof. Um, yeah. So interestingly, I mean, most store brand bourbons that you buy, unless you buy seek out a higher proof, if you just buy a standard, it's going to be 80 proof. So this is slightly higher than that, but it doesn't drink that way. It's not. I mean, I barely had any. I mean, I just had a tiny little sip here, but I'm not really getting that burn. Uh, but I quite like that. That's going to be difficult to not sit and just pour myself a glass. So I'm going to have to put that aside because I would like to share it in person with somebody. But I'm glad I got to share that with you here on the channel. I hope you found that interesting. Now, the downside of this, you can get it. Obviously, you can get it at Mount Vernon if you go. They have it in the stores there. I'm not sure if you can order it, but I'm a history nerd. I'm a sucker for this. And even back in 2016, when I saw this bottle, I thought it was very overpriced for what the size of the bottle was. And I remember picking it up and I put it back like 3 times. And then my friend who lives there, he's like, look, if you don't get it, you're going to go home. And immediately when you land, you're going to wish that you'd bought a bottle. And he's like, just get it and hold on to it, which is what I've been doing for, like I said, almost 10 years now. So, but it is overpriced. So it's not for everybody. I did it again from the history angle because I'm a history nerd and I thought it was cool to have something that came from there. So, definitely this is something that I'm going to share with some of my whiskey drinking friends. Okay. So, that's that. Now, as far as the record I was listening to, this is a fun one. This is Rolling with Leo by Leo Parker. And as you see here, this is from the Tone Poets series. So the quick version of this is that Blue Note Records is probably the best well-known label in the jazz industry. I mean, there's others. There's Riverside, there's Prestige, there was Verve. But Blue Note was kind of like the bop, hard bop especially, label. And years ago, they started putting out a series called Music Matters, where they were doing like audiophile quality repressings of like the standard Blue Note Bop catalog that had come out. And they're incredibly well done. They're also very, very expensive. So they are for like your hardcore jazz fans who wants like a perfection copy rather than like an original pressing, and you have the equipment and you have the ear to be able to tell the difference in those kinds of things. And so they were putting out these pressings called Music Matters that were the guy in charge was a guy named Joe Harley. And when Don Was from the band Was Not Was took over Blue Note, shortly thereafter, he ended up talking to Joe Harley, and he says, whatever you're doing with the Music Matters, I want to do that with a new concept that they're coming up with called Tone Poet. Now, these are produced in a very similar manner as the Music Matters thing, and the packaging and everything like that is done very, very well. But instead of reissuing like the classic albums that everybody would know, for example, Something Else by Cannonball Adderley. All right, I featured that on the channel here before. That's a very famous Blue Note album that everybody knows. Well, instead, what they're doing is like diving deep into the catalog of Blue Note and reissuing these records that have been out of print for years and never got a quality repressing. And so, the cool thing about it and why I have this record is that my friend, I've told you before, he owns a record shop here in Burbank called Run Out Groove, and I work there like one day a week, sometimes twice, to help out, and just because I like it. And he's my friend. I want him to succeed. He is an official Blue Note licensed dealer. He got that qualification from them. And he's in marketing like I am. And so he has the sign hanging up in the store, and he's able to get records from them, like buy them to resell. But he's like, I want to do more. And so he approached them and said, hey, would you ever consider doing like some kind of in-store event with Blue Note? Well, what they did was the guy who's in charge of Music Matters and Tone Poet, Joe Harley, came to his shop. And they also brought a gentleman by the name of Kevin Gray, who is a master engineer. He's a music engineer. He's done albums for Grateful Dead and Billy Joel and all this stuff, but he's currently doing a lot of albums with Blue Note. And he remasters pretty much, or he engineers, I should say, all of their high quality pressings that they're putting out, whether Tone Poet or Music Matters, right? So he was there. And one of the heads of Universal Music Group was there because Blue Note now falls under Universal. And also the general manager of Blue Note was there. They were all at this thing, and I was geeking out. Like, I showed up as a fan, and I immediately had to start working behind the register because people started buying records left and right, which was great. But they did an interview with Joe and with Kevin, and that was amazing just to hear them talk about how they put the series together and what's involved in it. And I'm probably geeking out a little too much on the engineering side of this, but it was a really cool thing to be there. Well, the other thing that was really cool is they had brought another employee who was DJing, and he had a bag full of Blue Note records, and he was putting them on the turntable, which is right next to the register where I was standing, where I was checking people out. And he and I started talking and geeking out about jazz and our favorite Blue Note albums and all this kind of stuff. And he pulled this album out of his bag and said, I have two of these because I bought one, and then Blue Note gave me one. Because he still has to get the album. So, and he said, I have two of these, and it was sealed. And he's like, here, take it. And I was like, are you sure? And then I asked my friend, I was like, okay, I was working at your shop. Do you want this as the shop copy? And he's like, no, he gave it to you. Take it. So that's why I have this. It's awesome. So here's the bag. And then you can just see the quality to detail on this. The packaging here, gatefold. Here's the album. And so Leo Parker was a baritone sax player. Started out on alto, I believe. Might have been soprano, but he switched to baritone, and he is one of the first, or I think he is the first baritone sax player to play bebop in that bebop style, which was very popular. So he played with like Dizzy Gillespie and like those kind of kings. And he was part of like this group of sax players that included like Sonny Stitt and Gene Ammons and Dexter Gordon. Leo Parker was one of those guys. So the reason you probably haven't heard of him is because, unfortunately, like many jazz people at that time, he had some issues with some drug addictions. And he died of a heart attack at age 36 in 1962. This album was originally recorded in 1961. However, it wasn't put out for release into the general public until 1980. So it's kind of like one of those lost albums. And then when you listen to it, you hear the energy and the beauty and kind of like these hints of like what was to come from this guy, from Leo Parker, because he was so good. And then he was taken from us too soon. So, not I wouldn't say it's a popular album by any means, but that's what is part of the fun of the Tone Poet series, is that you get to hear this music that you're probably just not used to and maybe haven't heard. And I highly encourage you to check it out because you might find something new that you really, really like. Okay, so that's going to be it for the bonus content here and for this video. So I would like to say once again, thanks so much for watching. I hope you liked this one on the monsters. And if you did like it, make sure to check out some of these other videos here to help out the channel or just to entertain and educate yourself. And cheers. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon.